Otherwise? Okay.
But I'm also fine with more light.
Whatever works for you. All right, we're going to begin. I'm sorry, I'm going to read off my phone. Thank you all very much for coming. Say your last name for me.
Wieszczek.
Wieszczek. Got it. Okay, my last name is Ordukanyan, so. My name is Marguerite Ordukanyan, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you here on behalf of the Damestad project. I am here filling in for my amazing colleague Jakob Klotz, who has put this program together, and he's doing research in Germany, so here I am. It is also our pleasure to welcome Krystyna Wieszczek, who is a Marie Curie postdoctoral research fellow at Columbia University and the University of Verona, Italy. She specializes in 20th century English literature and literary translation, reception, and censorship. Her first monograph, George Orwell and Communist Poland, Émigré, Official and Clandestine Receptions, which came out in 2025, and there are copies of it over there, covers the history of Orwell's reception both in communist Poland and outside, and traces his relationships with Polish exiles. Krystyna is also interested in the collective social impact of reading, and her current project, Life, Literature for Empowerment, supported by the European Union, explores empirical reception. She focuses on the potential of literature to enhance eudaimonic empowerment, a concept she's developing, which is a form of psychological empowerment grounded in eudaimonic well-being. Before beginning the Marie Curie Fellowship, she was an assistant professor in English philology at the Ignatianum Academy in Krakow, Poland, and an English lecturer at the University of Bologna in Italy. Prior to that, she had been a visiting scholar in English at the University of Milan. She holds a PhD from the University of Southampton in England, an MA in Translation Studies from Spain, and a Bachelor's in English Philology from Poland. Her publications on Orwell, communist censorship, Polish diaspora and migration, the empirical study of literature, education, and modernist architecture have appeared in England, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, Germany, South Korea, and the United States. Wow, so much to talk about. Okay, and just a couple of words about the project itself. Orwell on Both Sides of the Iron Curtain, the Story of Poland, which celebrating the Banned Books Week 2025 and the recent publication of George Orwell and Communist Poland, Émigré, Official and Clandestine Receptions. This lecture will explore the complex Polish reception of the iconic author, was also the theme of this year's Banned Book Week. And you know what, how about instead of me reading the description of the lecture, I just let you get straight to it. Yes, so then we do not end up repeating anything inadvertently. Thank you so much. Please help me to welcome Krystyna. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate your coming this evening. And I also want to thank Jascha, who couldn't be here, for inviting me, and Marguerite for organizing this here. So we are now in the Banned Books Week, organized by the Banned Books Coalition, which is an international alliance that aims to increase awareness about censorship attempts and to encourage the defense of freedom to read. And this talk, as has been mentioned, intends to celebrate that week and also the publication of the book. The talk will focus on the complex Polish reception of George Orwell, who was as if the epiphany for me of a censored writer in the Soviet bloc, and who is also the theme of this year's Banned Books Week, which reads, Censorship is so 1984. As an introduction, I will say a few words about Orwell and his writing, then about the book, and a few words about the context of post-war Poland and the Soviet-style censorship, introduced there after the Second World War. The main part of the talk is structured around 3 sections that correspond to the chapters of the book. The Émigré reception, that will look at translation and dissemination efforts in the West, at efforts to use techniques that could facilitate smuggling across the Iron Curtain, and the activists who participated in these activities. The second part will focus on clandestine reception and why people engaged in underground printing, distribution, and reading. And the third part will focus on the surprising ways Orwell's works and name managed to appear in official culture, despite the long-standing ban. And in conclusion, we will look at the value of the book and how and why Orwell inspires people through generations, and how the communist ban itself contributed to sanctioning Orwell's myth and a symbol of resistance. Orwell was born in India to a family described as an upper-lower middle class. His mother returned with her children to England when Orwell was a boy. And thanks to discounts and scholarships, he was able to attend public schools, which in England are private schools that are very expensive. Typically, students who attend these schools then go on to university, Oxford or Cambridge, but Orwell decided not to do that, and instead he joined the Indian Imperial Police in Burma. After 5 years, he quit. He was very traumatized and deeply critical of the colonial system. So it was then that he finally decided to do what he felt he wanted to do in life, to become a writer. To gather material, he spent some time with the poor and marginalized in London and Paris, what he then documented in his book Down and Out in Paris and London. And Burmese Days was his first published novel and was based on his Burmese experiences. Then he took an assignment to write about the poverty among the coal miners in the north of England, where he again went himself in person to collect material. And the book that he wrote became The Road to Wigan Pier. Some of his books are novels, some of his books are semi-autobiographical, where he mixes essay and biography. So, for example, in The Road to Wigan Pier, although he tries to document the fate of the English miners, the second part, for example, he uses to reflect on what socialism means to him and means in general. And as he was finishing that book, the Spanish Civil War broke out, and he decided to volunteer there. And even though he had just got married, he left in late December to join the forces. So, just a few words about the Spanish Civil War. It was a very brutal conflict between the democratically elected left-leaning government called the Republicans and a right-wing military rebellion led by General Francisco Franco. It became a proxy war for competing ideologies just before the Second World War, fascism, communism, and democracy. So, rather than joining the typical international brigades, as international participants, volunteers would do, Orwell ended up joining the POM, which was a Marxist workers' group. And this put him in a position to then observe how Stalin, while publicly supporting the Republican side, undermined it from within. The Soviet Union sought to control the anti-fascist movement through the Communist Party, and wanted to suppress the rival groups like POM or anarchist factions, so effectively betraying the cause. And the civil war ultimately ended with Franco's fascist dictatorship that lasted until 1975. Again, Orwell recorded his experiences in a semi-biographical book, Homage to Catalonia. And it's worth noting that he felt that his version of accounts from Spain faced a certain amount of censorship back in England. And the Spanish War was for Orwell a turning point. As he later wrote, quote, "The Spanish War and other events of 1936-37 turned the scale, and thereafter I knew where I stood. Every line of serious work that I have written since 1936 has been written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism, as I understand it." In the same essay, he also declared that what I have most wanted to do throughout the past 10 years is to make political writing into an art. My starting point is always a feeling of partisanship, a sense of injustice. When I sit down to write a book, I do not say to myself, I am going to produce a work of art. I write it because there is some light that I want to expose, some fact to which I want to draw attention, and my initial concern is to get a hearing. See, this is Orwell writing 10 years later. So it was also after Spain that Orwell wrote the two most famous books of his, Animal Farm in 1984. And Animal Farm was the book that brought him a wider international acclaim and also allowed him to be more comfortable financially. But the book had also been censored in wartime Britain. It had to wait 18 months for publication. Most likely it was to avoid offending Britain's ally, the Soviet Union, since the fable depicted a betrayed revolution on a farm ran by animals. For example, when one publisher already agreed to publish the book, he consulted an official at the Ministry of Information and then changed his mind. And later it turned out that that official was a Soviet spy. The book also had some difficulties to be published in the US at the time, and it was published in 1946. But 1984 didn't encounter any of these obstacles. It was quite the opposite. The USA subsidized its translations and distribution in many places around the world. So 1984 is quite dark. Orwell was writing it racing against death because he was already suffering from advanced tuberculosis, and the illness claimed his life in January 1950, and he finished the book. He published the book in June 1949. He had written a few more novels, but what he mostly did, in fact, was journalism and essays. And some say that he was a better essayist than he was a writer. So particularly his two last novels captured the public imagination at the time. A myth of a visionary became attached to Orwell, at least in the West. And now, 75 years after his death, he seems to be one of the most quoted British writers. And his pen name, Orwell, or Orwellian, is now a shorthand for denouncing many social concerns, from political double standards and authoritarianism, through the corruption of language, through the growing surveillance power of the tech companies, and the threat of misinformation. Curiously, what has happened to Orwell is also that people from across the political spectrum claim him and use his arguments and books to favor their views. I think that part of this universal appeal comes from the fact that Orwell also criticized the left, his own side, and also had a conservative streak in his character. And so sometimes you feel that you can find quotes to support your argument from whatever side. Orwell never visited the US, but he was interested in it, and during the war he contributed a London letter, a regular letter to the Partisan Review, which was at the time the one of the most significant literary journals here in the US. So now a few words about the book. So it draws on many primary sources, such as censorship files, diaries, and correspondence. And what I am particularly happy about is the correspondence that even the 21 volumes of the collected works of George Orwell thought was lost between Orwell and the Polish translator of Animal Farm. It also uses different sources such as radio broadcasts, publications from the period, Émigré publications, clandestine publications, and official publications, and artifacts, which we will later see. So the meanders of Orwell's reception allow us to explore the meanders of literature's battles with Polish censorship, while studying the various actions of literary suppression and resistance to it. The book engages with such other themes. For example, the importance of the media and literature for ideological control of the population and for resistance to such control. The role of individual actors in overcoming censorship and making cultural exchanges happen, and the role of institutions in that. The book is also naturally a study in translation history and reception history, both critical and material, that involves history of the book, their production and distribution. And the theme that also emerged is that it turns out that diaries and letters in this situation of state-imposed censorship can become the testaments of reception and response when we don't have the journals or magazines to look at because they are censored. And similarly, censorship files become testaments of official reception, the institutional reading of Orwell. Now, I would like us to look a little bit at the context of censorship and Polish context in history. So towards the end of the Second World War, the Soviet Union occupied Poland again on its way to Berlin. And this occupation lasted until 1989/92. To help install and maintain a Soviet-controlled government, aside from using open violence, the state monopolized the economy and with it, its cultural production. It used a comprehensive censorship system which was based on the Soviet one. The regime controlled, for example, paper allocation and printing facilities, but also job appointments and promotions and some other perks in universities, publishing houses, and other institutions. So it had the power to virtually erase a topic, a writer, from existence in public discourse. A pivotal structure at the end of this channel of publishing control was the censorship office. Together with its local branches, it had to, quote, control the dissemination of all kinds of works by the means of print, image, and the spoken word, unquote. This office was hidden from public view. note that it doesn't have the word censorship in its name. It also, until some liberating reforms won by the Solidarity movement in the 1980s, censors left no mark of their interventions in the text, and if a text was confiscated, there would be no sign of it, either in a published newspaper. And censors were supposed to follow specific, very detailed guidelines, directives, but these were also not for public view. So that last thing changed a little when, in the late 1970s, runaway censor offered a glimpse into the censorship's workings. He had painstakingly copied by hand the censor's book of rules and regulations. And he took this unknown risk of smuggling these documents to Sweden, leaving his young family behind, and then had them published in London, and then they made their way to the Polish underground as well. And the English version appeared in New York in 1984, very appropriately. So that book showed just how punctilious the prescription and the regulations were supposed to be, because it they had the desire to construct the reality in public communication. They ordered censors to remove any mention of a particular situation or particular person or particular text, or to mention them only in a specific way, negative, positive, or to signal any mention of someone to higher instances. So everything was supposed to be regulated. That reached the common person. After this, many people couldn't resist comparing this system to the Ministry of Truth from 1984, where the history was rewritten to adjust to the current party line. Today, however, we have many of the censorship files surviving in the archive, and they are free to be consulted. And even though the collection is incomplete, it is enormous, and even after the 35 years of research, researchers still have a lot of work to do in front of them. So in this censorship climate, George Orwell was an obvious target, since he was an early and impassioned Stalin's critic, and his books weren't published officially in Poland until the second half of the 1980s. But this fact didn't prevent his ideas and works from circulating among eager Polish audiences on both sides of the Iron Curtain, abroad and in the country. So Orwell and other banned writers made their way also to Poland. For example, he was published abroad. He was also a frequent reference in Émigré journalism, he in particular. Inside Poland, his reception went underground, and the clandestine publishing boomed in the late 1970s, but letters and diaries reveal that people did have access to his works even earlier. And despite the official ban, Orwell was never entirely absent from Poland, from the official circulation either. For example, we can find traces of presence in official publications, in library collections. And as I mentioned earlier, also what I consider that belongs to this official reception is the reception by the officials who created all these directives about censorship. So one of my books main argument is that when we have the situation of a state-imposed censorship, that can drive culture and literature and reception to function in three parallel, separate but interconnected modes: émigré, clandestine, and official. So now I would like to speak a little bit about the émigré reception. So one aspect that transpires across all the three modes of reception is the crucial role of individual agency in making such reception possible. For example, Teresa Jeleńska, a polyglot wife of a pre-war diplomat, felt electrified, as she later recalled, by a review of Animal Farm, which she saw just days after the publication. And she immediately contacted Orwell. She was then in Britain, in exile in Britain. And Orwell responded, and this is one of those lost letters, that he was anxious about translating Animal Farm into Polish and other Slav languages, but didn't quite know how to go about it. So the well-connected Jeleńska was instrumental in arranging for that. She, for example, was trying to arrange for the publication not only in Polish, but also in the USA, because Orwell still struggled with that. As Orwell wrote here, following on your telephone call last night, I rang up Mr. Kister. And this is an example also of how these activists abroad were interconnected, and these networks ran across oceans and borders after the Second World War. So, for example, the mentioned Mr. Kister, he had been transplanted to New York by the war, and in 1942 he established here Roy Publishers, a continuation of his publishing firm in Warsaw, which he co-owned. And it was interesting for me to discover that first he established it at the 25 West 45th Street, and then he moved that to 30 East 74th Street. So this publisher was offered the opportunity to publish Animal Farm in English in the US, in New York, but he turned it down, and didn't gain the Book of the Month Club accolade again. He had done this once. This could have been the second, but he turned the book down. There were also other émigrés who offered help to Orwell with publishing, translating, and distributing his books. And those proposals weren't limited to just Polish community. They included, for example, several languages: English, Italian, French, and Ukrainian, and circulating the Animal Farm in the United States, Italy, France, and Germany. From the previous letter, we also could see, for example, that Jeleńska was advising Orwell to make the book into a Disney film. And later, in another letter, Jeleńska would urge Orwell to, for example, send a copy of the book to the Italian minister Carlo Sforza, hoping that the book could change his politics. For example, here we have a letter from an idiosyncratic Polish count who proposed to translate it into French and promised that, if you care to authorize me to do it, I shall get all the French people I know to sit in committee on the poems and any other difficult matters, as was done at Joyce's own insistence with the French translation of Ulysses. Unquote. So not so much from some of these initiatives materialized, some did materialize, but they are telling examples, I think, of the activism and interest in Orwell. And individuals didn't achieve it all on their own. For instance, the publisher that Jeleńska eventually found for Animal Farm was a pre-war organization set up to maintain links with the Polish diaspora, and ironically, now itself exiled in London. They published the translation, possibly in a print run higher than the original English edition, 5,000 copies. And the organization's director later remembered that they managed to fulfill Orwell's wish and sent quite many, that's a quote, quite many copies to Poland behind the Iron Curtain. Another significant institution in the Polish reception of anti-communist or anti-Soviet authors was the Central Intelligence Agency, because among its overt and covert cultural operations, the CIA subsidized a number of publications, including the Polish translation of 1984, published by the Kultura Literary Institute, which became a very distinguished Émigré center in Paris, near Paris, and today is listed in the UNESCO's Memory of the World Register. The CIA also reissued Animal Farm, and in 1956 sent more than 100,000 copies drifting towards Poland in balloons.
Wow.
Around the same time, the CIA launched a book mailing program that continued until the early 1990s, and it was sending publications to Eastern Bloc. And another component of that program was the person-to-person distribution, where visitors to the West could just come and take the books that were on offer. And these distribution points were set across Europe, in England, in France, in Italy. And I went to the Polish Library in London, and this was one of such distribution and mailing points, and it kept reports which show that the recipients who were interested in Orwell came from all walks of life. It could be an electrician, a couple of retired World War II underground army veterans, a student, or a son of a prominent literary critic. So with the above, we have already touched on the question of distributing Orwell's works behind the Iron Curtain, but I would like to say a few things more. So the book mailing program sent around 10 million publications across the Iron Curtain by its closure in 1991, and 4 million of those were to Poland. This Animal Farm publisher declared a success, but we don't have the details about smuggling or sending the copies to Poland. Contraband methods used by the Literary Institute in Paris, the UNESCO-listed one, the publisher of 1984, included things like, for example, the diplomatic bag of the secretary to the French ambassador in Poland. And the publisher also collaborated with various activists from Poland to get their publications across. For example, one of them was really, I think, a record-breaking smuggler, the captain, who collaborated with the Institute uncaught for 26 years. Perhaps the most spectacular distribution method, as we've seen, but maybe not the most efficient, were the gas-filled balloons sent to Poland from Germany. And these actions took place related also to other countries, but Poland, after like a failed and really painful Warsaw uprising during the war, was very, where there wasn't help coming from outside, was really cautious not to incite another uprising with this kind of idea of help coming from outside. So they pushed it off, actually, but eventually eventually this balloon war, as it was called, did take place, and of course it included Orwell. For this, the Free Europe, supported by the CIA, an organization supported by the CIA, produced a new edition that was very thin and light, but nonetheless compacted all the images from the original book and could be more easily distributed to through balloons. So here we are touching already on the techniques used for publication that facilitated smuggling. So publishers strove to prepare these publications, and one of the techniques was this light paper. They also used miniature editions and false covers. The Literary Institute in Paris published miniature editions of some of its publications, and activists smuggled them in many different ways. For example, in factory-sealed food cans, posing as humanitarian aid, posing as pea or minced meat. The Institute also published the first edition of 1984 in two versions, a regular one, which we've seen, and another one with a false cover, using a Soviet-style propaganda poster. Over time, as borders opened more, collaboration between the émigrés and the clandestine activists in Poland strengthened, and clandestine groups would sometimes send agents abroad to establish connections, collect money, and eventually smuggling was not only about books and prints and publications, but also about equipment and materials for printing. Also, it's interesting that the two translations of Orwell's two most famous books served as blueprints for countless republications and re-editions underground until the official publication appeared in 1988. So now we are moving on to the clandestine reception. As mentioned, with clandestine printing and publishing became strong at the end of the 1970s. But even earlier we can find evidence of response or knowledge of some of Orwell's works, or at least about his myth. And here, for example, we have a quote from a diary of a journalist writer from 1954, which was a time of harsh, when the regime was harsh, people weren't still sure what was safe, what wasn't. So, for example, keeping a diary and writing about Orwell might not necessarily have been safe. Yet, for example, this journalist mentions Orwell a few times. I like, for example, here where when he went to a hotel and there was this blaring broadcast of the leader, the communist leader, and people were trying to work under that, and it seemed to him very Orwellian. And throughout the diary, we can see the appreciation already for Orwell, even so early. Although we can't be sure that he really had read 1984, even despite making these references. Because, for example, I found that another intellectual in Poland was making such references when commenting using Orwellian, and this is very Orwellian, when commenting on some phenomena that was happening around. But it turns out that it was only a few months later that he did actually note down in the diary that he read 1984. So Orwell's fame preceded his texts. But, for example, also there were cases when, but that was already after the regime became more, a little bit less strict after 1956, that, so there are these testimonies that, for example, the father of a young journalist brought a copy of Animal Farm from the foreign trip, and that sole copy had a few dozen readers in his home city. A striking example of accessing Orwell's famous novel and simultaneously trying to publish it emerged when an Orwell acolyte presented the National Library in Krakow with this unique edition of 1984, dating from around 1976. And in a letter he explained that the manuscript was created from listening to Radio Free Europe, which aired daily installments of the novel, and which I daily wrote on the typewriter in 6 copies. When the novel's broadcast ended, I had the manuscript bound and then distributed to friends for possible future transcription. In 1984, in the novel, Orwell envisioned what it might be like to read a banned book, portraying the moment when the protagonist, Winston Smith, lays his hands on a copy of the Emanuel Gonstein's Forbidden Book. A heavy black volume, amateurishly bound, with no name or title on the cover. The print also looked slightly irregular. The pages were worn at the edges and fell apart easily, as though the book had passed through many hands. And Orwell was quite accurate in that the underground printing faced significant challenges due to surveillance and shortages. Basic materials like paper and ink were often sourced through illicit or ingenious means, or even self-made, such as homemade ink substitutes and makeshift presses. All professionally built presses constructed from scratch, working hidden in plain sight or in elaborate concealed locations. As a result, the quality of the printed works varied greatly, from rudimentary, smashed and barely legible pages to professionally printed books. Distribution also required ingenious methods and caution. The pictures here, the picture above, for example, shows the DIY screen printing technique, where the innovation of using an elastic to lift the frame eliminated the need for a person to perform this task. And they are also using the homemade ink invented by a history professor. Orwell was promoted by underground activists of all stripes, from the left-leaning, like the group counting with the future Polish president, Bronisław Komorowski, to right-leaning groups like that of the future Minister of the Defense, Antoni Macierewicz. And from conservative Catholic-leaning groups to slightly esoteric publishers and liberal radicals. Students did much to promote Orwell. The first large publisher of a student provenance issued this memorable edition of Animal Farm, illustrated by the future cartoonist of the New York Times, just before he emigrated. The publisher's iconic founder is pictured here in the center. And sometimes students promoted Orwell with youthful humor, and sometimes, in fact, with a foreboding, like here, because before long, people would indeed wake up one Sunday to the sight of tanks in the street with the imposition of martial law in December 1981. So martial law, with its sudden internments, arrests, confiscations, curfew, travel bans, and shortages, paralyzed much of clandestine publishing. One publisher later recalled that everything was difficult at first. We didn't have the awareness yet that this internment wouldn't end in being deported to Russia, or perhaps they would execute us. But after the initial shock, and when some reverted to very basic techniques for printing, then later on, clandestine publishing picked up again. And here we have examples that not only Animal Farm and 1984 were published, but other works as well. There were, for example, essay translations or special issues about Orwell, and also other forms of dissemination. For example, comics, underground theater adaptations recorded on a cassette, and then mailed to Radio Free Europe and broadcast back to Poland on Christmas Eve. On Christmas Day. And here we can see an image that probably meant to reassure and encourage solidarity activists on a solidarity stamps. We had solidarity calendars and so on. So finally, official reception. So what I call official reception, as I already mentioned, is twofold for me. It comprises the state-approved presence of Orwell in periodicals, books, and libraries, and the internal reading of Orwell by officials who decided about the censorship rules, and which we can try to reconstruct from communist files. So, despite these apparently strict censorship rules, it is striking how extensive Orwell's presence could still be in the official circulation, even if often it was under the disguise of torrents of contempt. Yet he was mentioned, he was present. For example, here in 1984, an article in the organ of the Writers' Union apparently lamented that, let us not deceive ourselves, books by Kessler and Orwell, Vaux and Camus are circulating around Poland. And the commentator supposedly urged critics to do justice to such authors. Likely it was a rhetorical gesture rather than a real call for action, but the author, Orwell, was brought into the public forum, even if under the cover of contempt. If this was a specialist journal in 1984, which already was close to those political changes and some liberalization, here we have an example of a column from spring 1951, so the regime's harshest years, which was published in a few regional newspapers, which meant that they were addressing a popular reader. And the column was titled Literature of Death and Decay. It warned that contemporary, supposedly Western literature supposedly savors catastrophism, exemplified by Aldous Huxley's book Ape and Essence, a writer called Henry Miller, and a book titled 1984 by an author named Orwell, without explaining much. And most likely, the readers of these regional newspapers had no access to any of these writers. I'm sorry. Aldous Huxley was copiously published in the interwar period, but he was banned at the beginning of the communist period. Later on, his books could be published again, but not the Brave New World. But at the time, people wouldn't be able to consult this. So it's interesting to see actually what was said about Orwell. So, for example, he was compared much to Huxley when it came to slander and maltreatment of human dignity. And both writers' books were described as a criminal offensive of fear directed against peace and creative work-loving countries. And both were labeled warmongers and enemies of the human race. But also, I think that such an article could actually spark interest and push people to try to check what Orwell was about. And this happened in the harshest period of Stalinism. Some years later, Orwell began to appear in some, but not all, reference works. Here we have an example of the Polish literary bibliography, which in 1958 published a supplement for the years 1944-49. Itself a very interesting document, because in this supplement it reported what probably had been censored in the earlier editions. And here we can find several references to publications related to Orwell. The early Stalinist period saw a series of library purges that aimed at cleansing them of undesirable material, but over time, libraries began to add banned items to their holdings again through exchanges, purchases, and donations. These were kept either by specialist libraries or in special reserved collections in larger libraries. Albeit access to those collections required special privileges, and the use was often restricted to the use on site. But still, such apparent gaps in censorship made it possible to access some banned materials legally within the limitations imposed by the state, at least in large cities, though the path could be convoluted. One clandestine magazine had a contest, essay contest, and the contest winner recounted his own road to Orwell, which apparently began with scattered clues in official publications, such as a 1967 phrase, various Orwells, and a cryptic comparison to Graham Greene, from which he gathered that Orwell was likely an English writer, but he had no idea what he had written, until he eventually came across the title 1984 in another source. He discovered that the library did have a copy, but it was in the restricted special collections, and he couldn't access that. But later he traveled to Paris in hopes of buying the book, but in 1972 the book was sold out. The book in Polish was sold out. So he smuggled in a French edition, but he didn't read French. Sometime later, a friend found a very tattered English edition, and with much pain, they started translating it. And they stopped the work only when a Polish Émigré edition appeared in their circle, and likely this edition was a book confiscated at the borders and then recirculated. So his journey, as he wrote, took 8 years from first encountering the term various Orwells, and 3 years after identifying the title, and many years since he was born and since the publication. But this shows that it was not impossible to access banned books. even before clandestine publishing became widespread. So before we conclude, I want to draw our attention to one more aspect of the official reception, the reception among the inner leadership circles. Apparently, many officials were fascinated with Orwell. The writer Czesław Miłosz, a future Nobel laureate, claimed that Orwell astounded Polish officials, quote, through his insight into details they knew well, unquote, even though he had never lived in Russia. This was really astounding to many people, that Orwell could get such an understanding of how the Soviet system worked. I've also have come across the evidence of this in early debates, for example, on the correct Stalinist cultural policy in the early days of Stalinism, where the Deputy Minister for Culture liked to repeatedly claim the same kind of thing as we've seen in that little magazine, that Orwell personified hatred for humanity, representative of sickness of the Western bourgeois, imperialist, cosmopolitan culture, said in different forms. Great testaments of the literary reception on the inside, revealing the internal and institutional reading of banned authors, as mentioned, can be, of course, the communist files. And here we have a rare early censor's review from 1948 related to the confiscation of Animal Farm. As we can read, the censor reports that economic phenomena of the Soviet Union have been ridiculed in it and in a derisive manner, and presented as a willful job to the detriment of the citizens, the community, who have been harnessed by a clique of pigs to work more arduously than before, this time for the benefit of the clique of pigs. It is interesting to note that the censor doesn't attempt to disown any such problems and such situation, but is quite frank about reporting just what the book says. And the censor demands legal sanctions for the owner of this reactionary underground publication, derisory of the socialist system. In 1977, a 6-page long Orwell's profile was entered in the censor's reference book. It was titled Profile of George Orwell, an anti-communist writer, and was similarly open and frank and straightforward about Orwell. Here we have a quote about 1984, that it was unambiguously aimed at both communism and the Soviet Union, and became as if Orwell's political testament, published half a year before the author's death. It was supposed to be the last warning to the world about the communist danger. The culture department files, some files that I found, show why controllers of the much celebrated Warsaw International Book Fair confiscated Orwell year after year. It was because they wrote publications of because Orwell's books were publications of an ideological political character, dismantling the governing system in a socialist order in general and in the Soviet Union in particular. To conclude, I would like to briefly discuss what it all potentially meant to the activists in their time and possibly means to our times, and to reflect on the value of access to censored books. So, for Polish activists during the Cold War, translation and publication acquired layered values as literature, as a political weapon, as shared cultural capital, and a call for a united action. Books became objects of moral agency, worth smuggling, reading in secret, and even copying by hand. For Polish émigrés, the post-war period was very poignant. Many had fought in the Polish army in exile, believing that they were on the winning side, only to find that Poland was placed under the Soviet control. Both Émigré and activists in Poland tried to preserve national identity and culture against the occupants' design, a free Poland in exile or underground that could be restored after the occupation. So publishing and cultural activities were vital for this aim, and Orwell subscribed very well to these perspectives for many reasons. Shortly after submitting the translation manuscript, the translator of 1984 emphasized how crucial it was to prepare book translations for Poland's eventual liberation, believing that without the right literature, any effort to re-educate the generation brought up under the regime would fail. As the Stalinist regime was violently crushing democratic opposition after the war in Poland, even socialists, Orwell's newly published Animal Farm became particularly resonant, being an allegory of a betrayed revolution. The famous future translator Jeleńska recalled decades later how electrified she felt by the feeling of, quote, how appropriate for us the fable was. Orwell himself was anxious, as we've seen in the letter, to have it translated. Orwell's books apparently mattered so much to the Polish cause that an agency of the government in exile became its publisher, its eventual publisher. And it was one, I saw some documents, and it was one of very few foreign publications published during the time when the government lost international recognition and was struggling with funds, but still funded this book. And it even hired an award-winning illustrator, the former chancellor of the Warsaw Academy of Fine Arts, to illustrate the book. And it seems also that Orwell became special to people living behind the Iron Curtain. Some of his quotes entered the language before the text could, before people could actually read his work. One example of Orwell's great significance to Polish political activists may show up here. This is a series of books by Solidarity. At some point, it was a 10 million movement, a workers' movement that came to negotiate with the communist leadership in Poland. And they adopted Orwell as if their patron for their archive, for their documenting project, which resulted in over 30 publications and featured this, what you can see on the back covers. The project started after the communist state confiscated a lot of documents and materials at the introduction of martial law, and the Solidarity movement thought that this just proved once more that the communists always endeavor to manipulate history in an Orwellian fashion, and so they really wanted to document their activity to show other oppressed and socialist countries that it is possible to have a movement, it is possible to try to change their regime. In Poland, Orwell's works often took on a legendary status. 1984 in particular was seen almost like a sacred text sometimes. Those who read it often felt a powerful, almost transformative experience. One reader, a young reader, later an Émigré activist, recalled, quote, "For a few days I lived in a shock. That right before me is the description of the reality I was stuck in, but I wasn't aware of it. So my life's attitude became, Stay as far away from this as possible, unquote. Others spoke of the vocabulary that the book provided to understand and describe their oppressive environment. And the book wasn't just a political statement, it became a symbol of resistance. Ironically, it was the regime itself that helped elevate Orwell to this mythic status. By attempting to suppress the book and its author, it made Orwell and his work more interesting and more powerful. And finally, publishing censored books underground was an act of defiance. One publisher of Orwell said, "Issuing a book in 2,000 copies was akin to firing 2,000 bullets at the regime." This is all that I prepared.
Thank you so much for that. I obviously will have time for questions. I just wanted to say for my part, I find it fascinating because I know that one of the books that had really impacted Orwell, 1984, we were just talking about it, was a book by Mikhail Zemetsyn called We, which had not passed censorship in Russia and had somehow only survived because of translation into English and was able to reach Orwell and a broader audience, including arguably maybe Huxley as well, but only because of what you were saying about the power of translation to serve as a form of dissidence. So thank you so much. This was phenomenal. And if you guys have any questions.
I have a technical question out of curiosity. When you were working with libraries and archives, did you have a chance to see to leaf through the 84 type from the radio for Europe?
Can you say that again, if I had the chance to see?
Did you have a chance to leaf through the type version from the radio for Europe?
From the original manuscript of 1984?
Did you see it?
Wow, I could have.
Did you leaf through it?
I could have, but I didn't.
Okay.
Yeah,
Never mind. I was wondering if there were typos, how many typos were there, if any?
You know, they are digitalizing more and more content. It's worth checking, for example, if it isn't available through the Orwell estate, through the UCL archive nowadays, for example, that maybe it's available to see it. But I must admit, I was so engrossed in all this correspondence and all these diaries and documents that I didn't even go to see the original book.
I don't know a lot about background, so this might be a very basic question for you, but there was a mention of how he knew a lot about what was going on in Russia, Soviet Union. How did he gain that knowledge?
People in those days read, maybe it was easier to follow the journals and magazines and the press than it is today. So they were up to date on events, and so mainly from that. But he also was part of the intellectual circle in London, and even if he moved out of London and moved around, he still was part of that London intellectuals. Yes. He also had many contacts with Russian exiles and with exiles of all sorts, different countries. And he was actually very appreciative of what one could learn and what one could do. He even once used that, I forget which word he used, that immigrants or exiles are a godsend for trying to subvert the Soviet censorship.
Go ahead.
Did the UK government ever say to him, tone it down, or what are your sources or anything? Did they ever get involved at all?
Not that I know directly, but he worked on the BBC, for example, during the war. And I think he got a lot of ideas from that experience as well for his last book, 1984. He said that apparently the wartime censorship wasn't as gruesome and bad as one could have expected. Yet, for example, he couldn't publish his Animal Farm and was even thinking about publishing clandestinely in England. And there was something else I wanted to say. Whereas, for example, there is, I have come across some accounts of Polish exiles in England who had problems, and newspapers have been closed down because Poland was in a very hard situation, being placed between Russia, who wanted to occupy Poland, and being allies with England, who couldn't do much for preventing that. And so Poland wanted to always speak out about these atrocities of Stalin, whereas England wanted Poland to tone it down because it was bad for the alliance against Germany. So it was a difficult situation. And so for Polish emigres, some things were closed down. But Orwell, yes, said that phrase that the censorship, the wartime censorship could have been worse. Also, I remember now how the editors of one Polish newspaper, I don't remember very well, but they could have influenced the import of paper during the war. And they mentioned that to one of those official, the censorship information. I forget who that was. Maybe it was the Ministry of Information. And they mentioned that. And actually that the minutes of that conversation traveled to different embassies, to Australia, to India, I think. Yeah, eventually the journal was closed. But then it reopened, and it was kind of friendly with Orwell.
So maybe a little off topic, but you may not be an expert in logistics of balloon launches, but maybe you know.
I am not.
They were launched from Berlin, I guess, these balloons, and did they do them at night or during the day? Were they audacious about it? You don't know anything about that, right?
I don't know much, but they were, as far as I understand, launched from Munich.
From Munich?
Munich, which is where the Radio Free Europe was.
That's a long distance, though. They really... Okay.
So maybe I got it wrong. I have to check it.
They would have had to be launched from the Western controlled Germany, not from East Germany, which is where Berlin was, no?
I
West
thought it was
Berlin,
Munich.
Oh, I guess it was in both, yeah. Sorry.
Mhm.
I mean, it could have been from the three Western powers in Berlin, right?
I guess, but I think maybe Berlin would have been too close to the monitored,
Oh, it could get blocked, yes.
because there was just as the Western part was, helped by the West, I guess the Eastern part would have been so heavily surveilled by the Soviets that it would have been a difficult thing to accomplish.
I have come across Munich, but maybe they
Sorry,
did
I
that
didn't
from
mean to-
different places as well, not always from there. Yeah, I don't know, do you know anything more?
No, I mean, I would.
What year was this balloon operation? What year was this balloon operation?
So it was, so it started in 1955.
So it was before the Berlin Wall, so it was fairly loose. It was easy to travel between.
I'm sorry, can
It
you?
was before the Berlin Wall, so it was easier to travel from West Berlin to eastern
Yeah.
parts. It's different.
Yes. Yeah. So, yes, they started in 1955 and ended with this transformation of 56, the thaw, the so-called thaw.
Do they know how successful was it? Like how many balloons have reached Poland?
I don't think they do. I don't think it's possible to know, but I don't know how successful that was. But, for example, people who found such things were supposed to turn them in, and I'm sorry, I wrote this book. It was my PhD, and some information I can see is evaporating from my brain, but because there was an article about studying a particular region about this, and then there was a number, but I'm a person of words rather than numbers, and I can't recollect this, but I could check it if you're interested. I could try to dig it out.
Yeah, I'm just interested, I mean, it looks like they're bright, different colored balloons, as if it's a daytime operation and they're just like rubbing the noses in it rather than a nighttime thing. That just curiosity.
How long it takes to get there. The wind speed, how they propel it, if they check the weather reports.
And the
Direct
wind,
it, yeah, it's pure by wind.
I think we're going to maybe wrap up here, and we can hang out here for a little bit more for a less formal portion of the evening while I get the audio visuals here to close us down. But thank you again so much. This was fascinating, wonderful, super informative, and as someone who grew up on the other side of the Iron Curtain, I especially tremendously enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.